Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for September the 18th, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this Saturday. Hope you've had a great week, by the way. And so our text for today, let's jump right on in. Our 2 Samuel 14, 2 Corinthians 7, Ezekiel 21, which is a kind of a shocking text, not surprising for Ezekiel, right? Then finally Psalm 68. So why don't we start out with Psalm 68? I've got my Bible turned there. So Psalm 68 is an interesting psalm. Some have suggested that it is a psalm of David, but some have suggested that since it contains various themes, that it might be a collection of different psalms that have been brought together over time. But frankly, I don't think you have to go there. I think that many times you'll see psalms that seem to be saying different things or seem to be focusing on different themes, but in actuality, there is something that unites them. In this case, I think that what unites this is a focus on the activity of God towards his people. It's a praise psalm for what God has done for his people. Look at just looking through here, for instance, that God is a father of the fatherless, a judge for the widows. It's God in his holy habitation. So it's a beautiful picture of the God who does things. If you remember, I think it was 2 years ago, I did a sermon series on the God who, and it just went through the different actions of God, that God was a God who is active in our lives. And this is a psalm that really does illustrate this. I'm always impressed in the Old Testament, and in the New as well, but in the Old Testament, how many times it's said that God is defending the defenseless. In fact, for instance, when Mary celebrates in the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1, the event that she sings that after, of course, the baby Jesus leaps in her womb, if you remember that account. But she focuses in on God, a God who defends the fatherless, who lifts up those who are impoverished, and these types of things, that those who are defenseless in society, God takes interest in, and he expects his people to do the same. But good way of reading this psalm then would be to read through and just note how many times or know what it says about what God actually does, and then celebrate what God has done. A good place to look, for instance, is blessed be the Lord, verse 19, who daily bears our burden. The God who is our salvation. Well, why does it say he is our salvation? He's talking about the fact that he is the only way that we can experience that salvation. And to God, the Lord escapes from death. God is a God of deliverances. So very active psalm here that speaks of what God has done on behalf of people and on behalf of us. Psalm 68. Let's move over to, we'll deal with a less rosy picture here in Ezekiel 21. This is a section in Ezekiel where we get to the famous Song of the Sword. Verse 9 is especially where this is seen, a sword sharpened and polished. Sword is there's several different episodes in Ezekiel 21, but they all focus on this image of a sword. But what it really focuses in on is on the severity of God's judgment that's coming on his people. And let's see, how should I approach this? I did a paper one time in seminary. It was on the instruments and agents of death in the book of Ezekiel. That sounds like a fun topic, doesn't it? And it shows how God will often use these instruments and agents to exert his disciplinary measures on his people. Sometimes those are plague, pestilence, sword, famine, and of course many of these are those covenant curses that God uses as secondary means of discipline. But what's powerful about Ezekiel 21 is that this is not a secondary means. This is God's own sword, and it's powerful. It's also sobering that God is himself coming to discipline his people. But sword is also one of the covenant curses as well. But in this case, it's being wielded by God. Now, again, when I say covenant curses, I'm talking about these disciplinary measures for people who are out of covenant relationship with God, that God brings on his old people in the old covenant. to bring them back in the right covenant relationship. So as you read through Ezekiel 21, I think it's intended to be shocking for us. And yet it's also something that shows how seriously God takes the purity of his people, how serious he takes his own name, and how serious he takes his people's relationship with him and his desire to see them to return back to him in right covenant relationship. Ezekiel 21. And finally, or we're not finally, we got 2 Samuel 14, and then we have 2 Corinthians 7. Let's go to 2 Samuel 14 just very quickly. So remember that Absalom had been, actually, I don't think I mentioned this yesterday, but this is after Absalom had his brother Amnon murdered, that Absalom fled. This is verse 34 of chapter 13, and he went into exile and fled to Talmai, which is the king, who was the king who was in Geshur, the king of Geshur. And David mourned for him, but Absalom remained in exile. Well, Joab apparently wanted to try to reconcile them. And so he employs this wise woman from Tekoa. Now, Tekoa will sound familiar to some of you because this is actually the hometown of the prophet Amos. It's a small community south of Bethlehem, where it was kind of like Bethlehem, a shepherding community. And this wise woman comes up, and it's a very similar episode, by the way, to what we find in Nathan, the prophet, when he confronts David just a few chapters earlier. Here, this woman tells a parable to try to get David to do something. Well, Nathan was a little bit more, obviously, Nathan was speaking for the Lord. This woman's speaking for Joab. So Joab gets this wise woman, so to speak, to come and try to get David to return Absalom to the kingdom, and it works. So I'm not going to go through the entire little episode, but she basically paints this picture of a situation just like David's, where a son had killed another son of hers, and now they were going to kill. The community was going to come and kill this other son and discipline him for murder, and this was going to cause her to lose both her sons. And David says, well, that can't happen. I'm going to step in. And she says, no, this is you. This is the one who needs to restore his son. And so Absalom ends up being restored. And at the end of this, the king kisses Absalom, and they're restored to each other. What's interesting, though, is when we get to Absalom at the end, you see some hints here at the end. And I want you to take note of this for future narratives, because especially in chapter 15, that there are hints that not all is right with Absalom, and he's got some definite character flaws, and he's also has some aspirations more than just being restored to David's house. He wants David's house, and so you see hints of that even in this narrative in chapter 14. That brings us finally to 2 Corinthians chapter 7. So Paul in 2 Corinthians 7 continues his discussion, at least in the first 4 verses, of his defense of his apostleship. And you'll also notice that in verses 2 through 4, really, remember chapter 7, verse 1 kind of went with the previous chapter, at least in terms of its argument. But in verse 2, he makes a similar statement that he makes back in chapter 6 as well, where he says, make room for us in your hearts. So he's hoping for reconciliation with him in the Corinthian church. And then in verses 5 through the rest of the chapter, the end of the chapter, it kind of picks up actually where Paul had left it off, all the way back in chapter 2, verse 13. So it's almost like this big excursus of Paul's from chapter 2, verse 14 to chapter 7, verse 4, defending his apostleship. And now he's picking up where he left off with his arrival in Macedonia in verse 5. And then he expresses the comfort and encouragement he felt when he heard about so he's kind of rehashing what had happened when he heard about the Corinthians' repentance and the obedience that they had from Titus. So this was after that tearful letter, which he refers to in this text, verse 8, for I caused you sorrow with my letter, but I don't regret it because it resulted in them being reconciled to each other. So something, again, that my Bible here has it titled, Paul Reveals His Heart. And I think that's a pretty good title for this chapter in 2 Corinthians. So I think that's it for today. Hope you have a great rest of the day. Hope you have a great weekend, and I will talk to you later.